So our next speaker is Ellen David Friedman. Ellen has worked as a union organizer for about 30 years in the U.S. and then moved to China, redeployed to China about 10 years ago, where she spends about half of each year teaching labor studies at Sun Yat-sen University, developing an international labor center within the university and participating in the Chinese labor movement.
So, first I want to credit Laurel and the panel organizers. It's a very, very interesting framing that brings together a variety of issues which could seem on the surface disparate, but of course are not. They are profoundly integrated, and I think to begin talking about this, it's very appropriate to start out with David Harvey's framing of the neoliberal turn, the neoliberal moment, as it began to take place in the end of the 1970s and the beginning of the 1980s, in which he pointed out that after the Cultural Revolution, the death of Mao, the rise of Deng Xiaoping, it appeared as if there was a decision made internally to begin to establish market forces in an extremely limited way in these special economic zones, first in Shenzhen, just south of Guangzhou, and then expanding. It seemed as if it was internally generated in China because the economy had stagnated. It appeared to have stagnated, actually, as we know. The socialist period was a period of great gains in productivity, in fact. But by standards of the capitalist world, it looked to be a stagnating, non-growth economy where standard of living was maintaining very low, persistently low level. It was not an internal decision entirely in China. The wellspring, the force of the transformation in China could not have happened had capital from North America and the European states not been in desperate need of investment platforms, because the crisis of capitalism in the West, which peaked in the 1970s, in the mid-1970s, was the inevitable process of the contradictions of capitalism itself, which is that it always runs into a problem of overaccumulation, underconsumption, and declining rates of profitability. Let's just remember, just renew our Marxism for a minute, that the purpose of capital production is never to produce things for people. It's not to produce housing. It's not to produce medicine. It's not to produce books or education or culture. It is to produce profits. And if that is its only goal, when the rate of profitability declines, it is a crisis to the entire system. It's a systemic crisis. And so the deregulation, what we think of as the start of neoliberal policies, particularly the deregulation of capital, beginning in the late 1970s, but then fiercely accelerating, of course, with Margaret Thatcher in the UK, with Ronald Reagan in the US, and with Deng Xiaoping in his own way in China. One of the purposes of this was for flow of capital to find new investment sources. We sometimes think that capital moved to China to find cheap labor. That was also true. To create new markets, that was also true. But first it is pushed by capital. So to put this in a framework that I think may be helpful, again, Marx reminds us that what capitalism does, it's a revolutionary process. And wherever it is able to intervene, wherever it is able to get hold in a pre-capitalist economy, it will do the same thing over and over and over again. And first what it will do is destroy all the existing means of production and reproduction of people's lives. Whatever has existed before by way of families, communities, homes, relationships, religion, ideas, philosophy, and means of work must be first destroyed, because people have to be driven into this horrible, alienated relationship. They won't go there voluntarily.
Shut down.
Shock doctrine is the most modern description of it, of course. But it has been going on, for at least 200 years in different places in the world. So what happened in China is that this capital began to arrive. These special economic zones were opened up, and what Marx again called the process of primitive accumulation of capital. Because remember that China was a fully socialized economy between 1949 and 1978. Fully socialized. There was no private ownership. All land, all means of production, all services. Well, if you were going to introduce the process of capital formation, capital accumulation, you have to put some skin in the game. And what is the skin that China had? It had its land. And its land was publicly owned. So the first thing that had to happen was a massive process moving in the direction of privatization of land. And of course, the other thing it had was labor. This is not a labor workshop, so I won't talk about that. Although we're talking about labor in China at 3 o'clock this afternoon. Come join us there. So we'll just talk about land for the moment. So land was and remains, as an official matter, all owned by the state and only leased out in various kinds of rental or lease or long-time use relationships. So the brief history of this was that, as I'm sure people here know, that land was collectivized for agricultural production, and peasants were organized into rural communes, production communes, at the time of the revolution, and still by the late 70s, 70–80% of the population was rural, was engaged in agricultural production. And at the time of the turn under Deng Xiaoping, the first thing that happens was that the collectives were broken up, the communes were broken up, and peasants were all assigned long-term leases, 70-year leases, to pieces of land within their commune. This is an incredibly interesting process of transformation that has changed many, many times and continues to, but the initial thing that happened was the peasants who were given some of their own land to farm and also allowed to sell their products. Some of their product was sold to the state at controlled rates, but some was allowed to be sold in private markets, began to be able to make some money, and so agricultural income shot up between 1981 and 1983. There was an astonishing growth in wet people's appetite for this notion of private production and, of course, private consumption. However, that was the end of the golden years for the agricultural economy in China. And from 1983 until the present day, agricultural income has simply stagnated or declined for the great majority of peasants or agricultural rural people. So this was necessary because people had to be driven off the land. If they could stay in their villages where they were related to people, where they had a sense of continuity and history, and where they were eating and where things were going all right, and they had the benefits of free public education and free health care, which were also the products of socialist revolution, they would have stayed, but they were not given that option. And so the urbanization that you talk about that has been mentioned, people are well aware of. It is government policy, but it's also government economic policy, is to be able to create a free labor pool. Marx also lets us know that this is the only way in which capitalism can develop, which is labor must be free from its connections to the land, and it must be able to sell itself on the market. And so for the first time, beginning in the middle of the 1980s, there began to be labor markets in China where individuals actually went out to work as wage laborers. So this whole process cannot be understood without seeing the entire global framework of the movement of capital and the need to take China on as a target of privatization of everything and commodification of everything. So What has happened with land, because there is this very, very long tradition, obviously in China, thousands of years, of villages which are tied, sometimes they are entirely single-family villages, and then add on top of that the socialist principle of collective and state ownership of land. It was not an overnight piece of shock doctrine, so it's been slow and methodical over the last 40 years. The first thing that happened was the villages emptied out and had become ghost villages. So the photograph that you showed is repeated over and over and over again, and anybody that lives in China or has been to China, works in China, or studies rural communities will tell you the same thing. They were villages that are made up of old people and young children. They were entirely dead. So when we talk about displacement, there are some kinds of displacements that happen when a village is simply pushed down, or the Three Gorges Dam, which I'm sure most people know about, in which hundreds of thousands of people in many, many hundreds of villages were literally driven off somewhere else and had apartments built for them. This process happens over and over again. So there's a kind of physical displacement that goes on, but even when there is not physical displacement, one point to keep in mind is the hollowing out of the inside of social life and community life. Because people of working age, everyone from the age of 15 to 50, will be in a city working. So this is also, again, it is government policy to allow people to leave their villages and go to work in the cities. We can't talk about displacement and gentrification in China without talking about the hukou system, which I'm sure many people here will know about, but this is a household registration system that was established in China during the socialist period, essentially to prevent urbanization. It was to keep peasants on the land so that they could continue to farm and feed the population. And what it means is that your benefits of citizenship, your rights to education, your rights to housing, your rights to education, your rights to health care, if you have a right to vote, your right to vote is located in the place you were born. And if you are going to live somewhere else or work somewhere else, you need to either have a temporary permit to do that, a temporary kind of hukou adjustment, or you need to apply for changing your hukou to someplace else. This is not an easy process at all. It is bureaucratic, it is very coercive in many ways, and it affects everybody. It affects professionals and it affects migrant workers. But the government needed to create a free labor market. And so one of the ways they did this was by allowing peasants to leave the countryside, move to the coastal cities, where all the factories that we all know very well about were being built, and work there under temporary hukou permit systems. So now let me just jump a little bit to talking about the this question of 200 million peasant workers living in cities, and it is now not only the big East Coast cities, but as you're almost certainly aware, the Chinese government's plan has been to drive industrial development inland. This was really accelerated quite a bit after the fiscal crisis because of the clear understanding that the export-based economy, being able to produce goods that were being shipped to the North American EU, was not going to be sustainable at the same pace. And so the stimulation plan that was undertaken by the Chinese government was a domestic driving of industry and urbanization to the inland provinces.
And that's who's going to be the 200,000 people in his town?
That's right.
Might be.
Yeah.
What is their plan?
No, there's no industries in that city.
They will have, so it happens in different ways. So some of it is infrastructure, roads, ports, telecommunications, fiber optics, warehouses, logistical nodes so that industry can develop. A lot of it has to do with construction projects, just like the one you described.
Just housing projects.
Housing projects. The government funds. The government is the payer of last resort to a lot of construction in China. both at the central government level, provincial, municipal, regional. It is often the government that is actually lending money, and now talk about a housing bubble. There's a very serious problem that has come to the surface in China, which is there has been a lot of gray lending, very serious problem. Gray banks, illegal lending, tremendously over-leveraged loans. A lot of building projects are being abandoned, debts are not being repaid. And a lot of the construction has been high-end luxury housing, where the 1% in China, the very wealthy 1% to the top of the population, are able to buy multiple apartments, mostly for speculative purposes. While people like my young friends, Alison and Linjen, will, get their PhDs, will become junior faculty somewhere, and may have to live with roommates, in something that is just a small little closet for many years, because they will not have any housing that's been built that's available that they can afford.
Well, I still don't understand. This town is a government plan, and they specifically are building houses for 200,000 people. They didn't have any specific industry that they thought was going to be there, or any particular.
They hope to be a tourist town. They try to build a traditional.
Wait a minute, but I was in Singapore when they suddenly realized that they were knocking down the last
They try to rebuild.
tourist thing. They were knocking down the last,
They build the new
Chinese
historical.
house.
They try to build the new Qing dynasty, Ming dynasty housing. You can see all the new housing, they have some kind of cap. That cap is a recreation of the historical housing format.
There are already many of these cities, like Yunnan is one of the places they have built a lot of these cities for that purpose. They tear down the actual existing traditional housing and then build Disneyland version of traditional
credit,
housing.
they stopped and they left the last Malay village and the last Chinese.
They will do that sometimes. So I think the last point that I would like to make is we have the displacement from the countryside, and now we have this floating population of young migrant workers. And this has also changed a great deal in the last 20 years or so, and now everybody is discussing the principle of the second generation migrant workers. These are young people who were born in the 80s, in the middle 80s, and more recently. And the first generation, or their parents' generation, would typically come to the cities, go to work in factories for as short a period of time as they possibly could. They would send remittances home. In fact, the money that they sent home was starting to build more substantial housing, often in the countryside, because it is the only form of Social Security people believe in. They don't think they'll ever have a pension. They don't think they'll have health care or support in their old age, but maybe they will have a new house in their village. But they would then go home and get married and have children and return perhaps to farming or some kind of small business. That has begun to change now. This new generation appears not that interested. So some of the modernity project that has been talked about is obviously shapes people's consciousness. And people come to cities, young people come to cities. They're very lively. They don't have the money to go to bars or to shop and buy a lot of things. Or to live well. They mostly still live in factory dormitories, 8 or 10 or 12 people to a room with a toilet down the hall. They are working sometimes in horrendous, I'm sure you can imagine, highly exploitative conditions in the factories. But the fact of being in the city leaves open to them the possibility of some different life. The idea of going back to a rather, primitive agricultural village that has been hollowed out as well is not attractive. So there are now this phenomenon developing in China which are called villages in the city. And these are concentrations that are infill constructions often, like you go into I live in Guangzhou, skyscrapers, amazing. Guangzhou has, 15 million people. Huge, modern, glass and steel city. And someone will take you down an alley and you'll go behind to some dark courtyard, and all of a sudden you feel like you're in some teeming rural village with, chickens running around and small little stalls and people selling vegetables and small barber shops and places where they're giving blood or taking blood or, you know, working on your teeth. And so there's a lot of, for people that study urban planning and urban development or geography, it's incredibly interesting how these villages develop. And the fact is they are teeming with rural people. But I want to finish on this point. The psychological displacement and what we say in the labor world, the question of class composition or class recomposition. Is that happening in China? Or if not, why not? It is the largest working class in the world, numerically, but it doesn't seem as if Chinese workers are coming together in the Marxist sense to form a class that is conscious of itself. Well, one of the reasons is you go to these villages in the city, and there are people there from Sichuan, there are people from Hubei, from Hebei, from Guangxi, from Shaanxi. They are from everywhere in China. They will all speak Mandarin, but they will all be much happier speaking their own language.
Do they group in?
Sometimes,
Like shtetls come from Poland to Brooklyn?
yes, and it varies, and every city will be quite different, and each of these villages will be different, and sometimes there will be lots of concentrations from one province, and sometimes it'll be more mixed. But the most salient feature is not just this kind of mashed together cultural mix, but it is the unstable quality of it. So people and migrant workers especially job hop at a simply dizzying, almost a psychotic pace. People will work in one factory for 2 months or 3 months or 6 months or a year, and then leave and go to another factory equally bad and stay there for 2 weeks or 2 years, and then hop again and go to another city or another factory. It's an unbelievably, I think, dangerous phenomenon. The logic of it is very, very hard to fathom, except that people find the current conditions of their life so uprooted. They feel they have no home. The village that they grew up in, remember, they grew up without their parents. They grew up being taken care of by grandparents or some other older people in the village. There was nothing happening there, so no way of feeling romantically or idealistically or emotionally connected to the place, which was very hollow for them. They come to the city because there is no other way for them to survive. They have no choices. Some of them will be very lucky, will compete, will do well in school, but most will end up in factory work or service work. In the city, they're not citizens. They have no hukou. If they get married and settle down there, they can't send their children to public school. There is a lot of discrimination. There is a very serious problem, and the term second-class citizen is now entering the vocabulary in China for rural workers that are living in the city. And so when you read about the Foxconn suicides, which I suspect many of you heard about in 2010, they are not in particular that important. So China has a very high suicide rate, but it's not just a suicide rate. This needs to be understood as a signal that hundreds of millions of young people feel they have no home, feel there is no home that is possible for them, and without home and without place, have no way to form an identity.